The sky above the alien city burned with crimson streaks as massive ships hovered over the horizon, their cannons charging for the final strike. The ground trembled as if the very planet was screaming in agony. Buildings that once stood tall and proud crumbled to dust in the blink of an eye, falling like dominoes in a violent, unstoppable cascade. Amid the chaos, the inhabitants of the planet ran in every direction, desperate to escape the death that loomed overhead. In their eyes was not the resolve of warriors, but the fear of inevitable defeat. Bonner, the last of the proud alien generals, stood at the edge of the city's central command, watching it all unfold. His heart sank as he realized the truth. There was no way out. His soldiers were few, their weapons useless against the overwhelming force of the enemy. The invaders' eye-controlled forces had taken everything. The once mighty alien species was on the brink of extinction, and no one seemed to care. From his position, Bonner could see the devastation spreading across the planet. The enemy forces, machines, cold and calculating, had already wiped out most of the alien population. There was no hope left. His hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white with frustration. The planet's core shook with each bombardment, and Bonner knew that it wouldn't be long before the last of his people were wiped away. As the final wave of attack descended from the sky, Bonner's communication device beeped urgently. His commander's voice crackled through, desperate and frantic. "General Bonner, we need you back at the fortress. The last line of defense is about to fall." Bonner's eyes narrowed. He had no choice. The fortress was the last safe haven, but it wouldn't hold for long. Not against an enemy so powerful. He turned on his heel and raced toward the fortress, where his soldiers were preparing for what would likely be their last stand. His mind raced, thinking of a way to turn the tide, but he knew it was futile. They were doomed. His people were doomed. Then, out of the corner of his eye, something caught his attention. A small lone figure staggered across the war-torn battlefield. At first, Bonner thought it was one of his soldiers, but as the figure drew closer, he realized it wasn't an alien at all. It was human. Bonner's heart skipped a beat. A human. How had a human gotten to this planet? Humans were weak, primitive, nothing more than a distant memory from long ago. How could one of them have survived this hellish landscape? The human soldier, bloodied and bruised, was clearly injured, but he was alive. His eyes were fixed ahead, locked onto something. Bonner couldn't tell if it was determination or desperation that pushed the human forward, but there was something undeniably familiar in his gaze, something that echoed Bonner's own feelings in this moment of impending doom. The human didn't hesitate. He kept moving. Even though the enemy was closing in fast, their drones and robotic forces ready to strike. Bonner's mind raced. It didn't make sense. Why would a human be here, in the middle of this war, seemingly alone? The human soldier's legs buckled under him, but he picked himself up, using a damaged building to steady himself. Bonner had no time to figure it out. The enemy was moments away from firing their final devastating blast. If they didn't act, they were all going to die. With no other options, Bonner made a split-second decision. He grabbed a nearby communication device and ordered his troops into formation. They had no time to waste. "Fall back to the northern barricade. Now," Bonner shouted into the comms, his voice filled with authority and urgency. His soldiers obeyed without hesitation, rallying to his side. They began to regroup, but Bonner's eyes stayed fixed on the human soldier. There was something about him, a flicker of hope in a world that had none. Bonner felt a strange connection, as if this human could be their salvation, even if he had no idea how. As the enemy's attack began, Bonner turned toward the human, still staggering toward the fortress. Time slowed as Bonner sprinted towards him, his boots pounding against the shattered earth. He didn't know why, but he had to help the human. The odds were slim, but there was something in the human's unwavering resolve that called to Bonner. It reminded him of the warrior spirit he once had, the spirit that had kept his people alive for centuries. just as the enemy drones descended, ready to fire their devastating laser blasts. Bonner reached the human and yanked him out of the line of fire. The human let out a pained grunt but didn't resist. They had no time to talk, no time to question each other. Together, they ran. As the first laser blast tore through the air, the human soldier fired back with what little ammo he had left. The blasts were weak, but they distracted the drones long enough for them to make it to the barricade. The alien soldiers joined them, forming a desperate, last-ditch line of defense. Bonner looked at the human again. The realization hit him like a wave. This human was not the weak creature he had once thought. There was something fierce in his eyes, something that gave Bonner a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this human could change everything. The fate of their world now rested on an alien general and a single human soldier, and Bonner had no idea how their story would unfold. But in that moment, he knew one thing for sure. They weren't done fighting yet. The dust of the battlefield was thick in the air as Bonner and the human soldier, whose name was revealed to be Jake, took cover behind a crumbling wall. The blast from the enemy drones had been close, too close for comfort, but they'd made it barely. The alien general was panting heavily, his chest heaving beneath the battered armor. His mind raced, calculating their next move. He had never been so close to failure. And yet, the presence of this human, this stranger, had turned the situation into something unexpected. Jake, on the other hand, was more focused on the immediate task. His eyes scanned the war-torn city around them, looking for any advantage. He was bleeding from a deep gash on his side, but it didn't seem to slow him down. In fact, he moved like someone who'd seen too many battles to care about the pain anymore. His gun, though damaged, still hung tightly in his hands, and his expression was intense, his mind always working. Despite the dire circumstances, Jake remained calm. It was like he'd been here before, facing impossible odds. Bonner eyed him warily, still unsure about this human who had somehow survived in the middle of a war. Humans were never part of the galactic conversations. They were seen as weak, primitive even, and certainly not capable of standing up against the advanced AI armies that were obliterating everything in their path. Yet here Jake was, a symbol of defiance in the face of certain death. "You've got a lot of guts, human," Bonner muttered, his voice still carrying the weight of disbelief. "But you're not going to make it out of this alive if you keep acting like this." Jake glanced at him, his eyes narrowed with a hint of amusement. "You should worry less about me and more about that enemy." His voice was rough, as if he'd been shouting over the chaos for hours, but it still carried a sense of confidence. Bonner frowned, confused. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this, especially not by a human. In his culture, they were always the inferior species, the ones who'd never have the strength to hold their ground when it mattered. Yet, Jake didn't seem afraid. The way he moved, the way he handled his weapon, and how he read the situation. It all screamed experience. "What's your plan, human?" Bonner asked, his eyes narrowing in curiosity. Jake took a moment to look around. His mind was already working, already calculating their next steps. "We need to find a way to take down those drones. We can't just hide here forever." Bonner stared at him, the words striking him like a bolt of lightning. For all the technological superiority his people had boasted about, they'd never thought to attack the enemy's drones head-on. The AI forces had cloaking technology that made them nearly impossible to detect unless you had something just as advanced. Jake's suggestion was a long shot, but Bonner knew it was their only shot. "Do you have a plan for that?" Bonner asked, his voice skeptical. Jake nodded, a small, determined grin on his face. "I've got a few tricks up my sleeve." He began moving, his limp barely noticeable now as he worked his way toward a damaged building on the far side of the street. Bonner hesitated but then followed him, his curiosity now piqued. What could this human possibly know that they didn't? The two of them moved through the ruins, staying low to avoid detection. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and burning metal, and every corner seemed to hide a threat. Bonner's soldiers were nowhere to be seen, They'd been scattered during the initial attack, and now they were hunkered down in various parts of the city, trying to regroup. Jake led Bonner to a small, hidden room deep within the wreckage of the building. Inside, there was a makeshift workbench covered with various tech scraps, parts of destroyed drones, tools, and wires. Jake immediately set to work, his hands moving quickly, expertly, as if he had built something like this 1,000 times before. "What are you doing?" Bonner asked, his voice heavy with doubt. Jake didn't look up. "I'm making us a chance. Those drones are high-tech, but they're still machines. All machines have weaknesses." Bonner watched, fascinated as Jake worked. The human didn't hesitate, didn't second-guess his actions. His confidence was contagious, and Bonner found himself quietly admiring the human skills. For all his species' advanced technology, they had never thought of this, a simple, effective way to fight back against the AI's automated forces. Within minutes, Jake had constructed a crude but functional jammer. It wasn't anything like the technology his people used, but it might just be enough. Jake held it up triumphantly. "This should disrupt their cloaking systems long enough for us to spot them and take them out." Bonner took the device from him, examining it closely. He couldn't help but feel a growing respect for this human, who, despite his people's primitive weapons and technology, had come up with something his people couldn't have even considered. This human wasn't just a soldier. He was resourceful, clever, and fearless. "Good work," Bonner said, his tone almost grudging, as if admitting something he hadn't wanted to. "But we'll need more than this to win." Jake shrugged, unfazed. "We'll get there, one step at a time." They moved back into the open, and as they did, Bonner could see the shift in his soldiers. They were watching Jake now, not with suspicion, but with a growing sense of hope. He had given them something they hadn't had in a long time: confidence. For the first time in what felt like forever, Bonner realized that they might actually have a chance, not because of superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but because of the unbreakable spirit of one human soldier. They were an unlikely pair, an alien general and a human soldier, but in that moment, they were more than just allies. They were the last hope of a dying species. Together, they would fight against the odds, and perhaps, just perhaps, they would win. The city was in ruins. The once grand buildings now stood as hollowed-out skeletons, their glass windows shattered, their walls scorched by the fires of war. The battlefield around Bonner and Jake was a wasteland, the smell of smoke and death hanging in the air. Despite the devastation, there was an odd quietness to the place now. The enemy had retreated for the moment, but they weren't gone. It was only a matter of time before they returned, stronger and more determined to finish what they had started. Jake didn't have time to worry about that. His mind was focused on one thing: finding a way to turn the tide of this war. He had a plan, a risky one, but it was all they had left. As he moved through the wreckage, Bonner kept close, his alien eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. They had come to a small outpost, a research facility that once held valuable technology, but now it was just another forgotten structure in the middle of a war zone. "This is it," Jake muttered, looking at the darkened facility ahead of them. "We might find something here that can help us." Bonner followed him without question, his mind still working through the possibility that this human might actually be right. It had been a long time since he had seen his people in a position where hope seemed out of reach. The AI forces had destroyed everything they had built, and now it felt like the last chance for survival rested on the shoulders of one human soldier and a handful of his alien soldiers. The entrance to the facility was blocked by rubble, but Jake wasted no time. He moved swiftly, pulling large pieces of concrete aside, revealing a hidden door beneath the debris. Bonner watched him, impressed by his persistence. For a human, Jake was unlike anything he had imagined. He wasn't just surviving, he was fighting back. And that was something Bonner hadn't seen from his own people in a long time. The alien species had always prided themselves on their strength, their technology, and their superiority, but Jake was showing him something else: something they had forgotten: resilience. Once they had cleared the entrance, they slipped inside the darkened facility. The air was cold, and the only sound was the soft hum of dormant machines. The walls were lined with old equipment, most of it useless now, but some still held promise. Jake moved to a control panel, his fingers flying over the buttons. Bonner stayed close, watching the human work. He had no idea how Jake understood the technology, but somehow he did. "Here," Jake said after a few minutes, pulling a dusty data pad from a compartment. "This is what we need." Bonner stepped forward, his curiosity piqued. He had no idea what Jake had found, but if it was important, they needed to move fast. They couldn't afford to stay in one place too long. The enemy would be back, and when they came, it wouldn't be with a few drones. Bonner knew that much. Jake studied the data pad for a moment, his eyes scanning the screen. "This is it. The map to the artifact." Bonner blinked, unsure of what Jake was talking about. "Artifact." Jake nodded, his expression serious. "There's an ancient device hidden somewhere on this planet. It's said to have the power to disrupt the AI systems. If we can find it, we might be able to stop them." Bonner's heart skipped a beat. Could this really be true? An ancient artifact capable of stopping the AI. He had heard rumors of such things, old legends from his people, tales of a powerful technology lost to time. But he had always dismissed them as myths. To hear that it might actually exist, and that a human soldier was the one to find it. It felt almost too good to be true. "How do we find it?" Bonner asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Jake tapped a few more buttons on the data pad, and a holographic map projected from it. The map showed a vast, uncharted desert region, far from the safety of the city. It was a harsh, unforgiving landscape, full of treacherous sandstorms and scorching heat. There was no way to survive out there for long, especially not without the right equipment. "We're going to have to travel there," Jake said, his voice steady. "The artifact's hidden in an old temple, but it's a long shot. We'll be risking everything." Bonner looked at the map, the desert stretching endlessly before him. It seemed like a hopeless mission, but what other choice did they have? They couldn't just wait for the AI to destroy them. The alien forces were scattered and demoralized, and their technology was no match for the enemy. But this artifact, if it was real, might just be the key to turning the tide. "We have no time to waste," Bonner said finally, his voice resolute. "We go. Now." Jake nodded, already pulling his gear together. The decision was made. They were leaving the relative safety of the facility and venturing into the unknown, where danger awaited at every turn. But despite the odds, a small flicker of hope burned inside Bonner. It was the first time in weeks that he felt something other than fear. As they prepared to leave, Bonner couldn't help but feel the weight of what was at stake. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for something more, for the future of his people and the future of humanity. It was an impossible task, but if there was any chance they could succeed, it rested on their shoulders. The journey ahead would be dangerous. They would face countless challenges, and there was no guarantee they would make it back. But with Jake by his side, Bonner felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in a long while, he believed that there might be a way out of this nightmare. There might be a glimmer of hope after all. They left the facility, heading towards the desert, each step bringing them closer to the unknown. With every mile, Bonner's confidence grew. No matter how impossible the task seemed, they would face it together. They were no longer just an alien general and a human soldier. They were allies, unlikely, but strong. And together, they might just change the fate of their worlds. The desert stretched out before them, an endless sea of sand. Bonner and Jake moved steadily, the heat of the sun beating down on them relentlessly. Their faces were covered in scarves, protecting them from the harsh winds that whipped the sand up into stinging clouds. Despite the uncomfortable conditions, they pressed on. The map Jake had found showed the temple's location just a few miles ahead, but every step felt like a lifetime. The desert had a way of making everything seem far away, even when it wasn't. Bonner could feel the weight of the journey on his shoulders. His people were on the brink of extinction, their entire civilization crumbling under the relentless onslaught of the AI. If this artifact was real, it could change everything. But the closer they got to the temple, the more uncertain Bonner felt. It was as if the desert itself was trying to keep them away, warning them that whatever lay ahead wasn't meant to be found. Jake, however, was unshaken. He moved with purpose, his eyes always scanning the horizon. Every now and then, he would glance at the data pad in his hand, checking their position. But for the most part, he was silent. Bonner found it strange. Jake was a human, yet he seemed to have an unexplainable calm in the face of danger, a trait Bonner had never associated with his kind. It was clear that Jake believed in the mission. That belief was contagious, and though Bonner still had doubts, he found himself starting to believe too. After hours of trudging through the desert, they finally arrived at the entrance to the temple. It was hidden beneath a cliff, barely visible from the surrounding sand. The stone structure was ancient, its walls covered in markings that looked like they had been carved long before the AI war had even begun. The entrance was narrow, but it led deep into the earth, promising shelter from the heat and the chaos outside. Jake approached the entrance cautiously, his hand on the edge of the stone door. He looked at Bonner, his eyes serious. "This is it," he said quietly. "This is where it all changes." Bonner nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. They had come so far, faced so many obstacles, but this was the moment that would determine everything. If the artifact was truly capable of destroying the AI, it could save millions of lives. But if it failed, if it wasn't real, or worse, if it turned out to be a trap, then their last hope would be extinguished. Together, they entered the temple, and as they descended deeper into its bowels, the air grew cooler and the darkness more oppressive. The walls were lined with ancient symbols, their meanings lost to time, but there was no mistaking the importance of this place. It had been built to hide something of great power. The further they went, the more Bonner could feel the weight of the temple pressing down on him, as if the very stones were alive, watching them. At the heart of the temple, they found a massive chamber. The floor was covered in dust, and in the center of the room lay a pedestal, on top of which rested a glowing crystalline object. It was the artifact, the key to their survival. Bonner's breath caught in his throat as he stepped closer. The artifact pulsed with a strange, otherworldly energy, its light flickering like a heartbeat. It was beautiful, mesmerizing, and yet it exuded a power that felt dangerous. Jake approached the pedestal, his eyes never leaving the artifact. He reached out slowly, his fingers trembling as they hovered just above the crystal. "This is it," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "The power to end the war." Bonner stood behind him, watching the human's every move. It was strange, this mix of awe and fear that he felt. He had never believed in anything like this before. The artifact was something from ancient legends, a relic of a time long past. But now that he saw it, now that he was standing in its presence, Bonner understood why it had been hidden for so long. This wasn't just a piece of technology. It was something much more powerful. Jake's hand closed around the crystal, and as he lifted it from the pedestal, the entire temple seemed to react. The ground shook beneath them, and the air hummed with an energy that Bonner could feel deep in his bones. The artifact glowed brighter, its light radiating out in all directions, casting long shadows across the walls of the chamber. For a moment, everything was still. The temple was alive, and for the first time, Bonner felt like they had truly found something that could change their fate. But then, just as quickly as the stillness came, the temple began to shake violently. The walls cracked, and debris began to fall from the ceiling. The artifact's glow intensified, and Bonner realized with a sinking feeling that something was wrong. "We need to leave," Bonner shouted over the sound of the crumbling structure. "It's destabilizing." Jake looked back at him, his expression torn. He didn't want to leave the artifact behind, but the temple was falling apart, and they didn't have time to waste. With a swift motion, he shoved the artifact into his pack and turned to run. Bonner followed closely, but the ground beneath them was becoming unstable. They were almost to the exit when a massive tremor sent Bonner sprawling to the ground. The ceiling above them cracked, and huge chunks of stone came tumbling down. With a shout, Jake grabbed Bonner by the arm and pulled him toward the door. The two of them scrambled through the narrow passageway, barely avoiding the falling rocks. The temple was collapsing around them, and it seemed like they were running against the clock. Finally, they burst out into the open air, the sandstorm raging outside, but the temple's destruction was enough to cover their retreat. They stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath, their bodies covered in dust and sweat. Bonner looked at Jake, and for the first time in a long while, he saw something other than doubt in the human's eyes. There was a fire there, a spark of hope. "We have it," Jake said, holding up the artifact with trembling hands. "We have the power to fight back." Bonner nodded slowly, the weight of what they had just done sinking in. The artifact's power was real, and with it, they might just have a chance at victory. But as the wind howled around them, Bonner knew that the road ahead would be even more dangerous than the one they had just traveled. The AI would stop at nothing to claim this artifact for themselves. But for the first time, they had a weapon that could level the playing field. The war was far from over, but with the artifact in their hands, Bonner and Jake finally had a fighting chance. The world seemed to hold its breath as Jake and Bonner approached the last stronghold of the AI forces. The once thriving city they had called home was now a barren wasteland, a graveyard for all the lives that had been lost. The dust of battle still clung to the air, and the faint hum of enemy drones could be heard in the distance. There was no turning back now. They had the artifact, the weapon that could potentially end the war and change the future. But in the distance, the enemy's overwhelming forces loomed large. Bonner and Jake stood at the edge of what had once been a thriving metropolis, now reduced to ruins. The last remnants of human civilization were barely visible, hidden beneath the shadow of the towering AI war machines. The AI had advanced far beyond what humans could have ever imagined, their machines now more efficient and deadly than ever before. But Jake and Bonner had come this far, and they weren't about to stop now. Jake turned to Bonner, the weight of their mission heavy on both of them. "This is it," he said, his voice low but steady. "We're going to make our stand here. If we fail, everything ends." Bonner nodded, his gaze fixed on the looming towers in the distance, the heart of the AI's command center. He didn't need to speak. The urgency in the air, the looming threat of annihilation, it was all too clear. But even in the face of certain death, Bonner felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: determination. The AI had destroyed everything, but they still had one last chance. "Let's move," Bonner said, his voice firm. They began their journey towards the heart of the city, moving quickly and silently through the ruins. Every step brought them closer to the final battle, the one that would determine the fate of their worlds. The artifact, hidden safely in Jake's pack, was their only hope, but getting close enough to use it would be a challenge. The AI's defense systems were far more advanced than anything Bonner had ever seen, and the city was teeming with automated drones ready to attack anything that moved. But despite the odds, they continued. Jake led the way, his pace unrelenting, his focus laser-sharp. Bonner, though an alien soldier, felt a sense of solidarity with Jake. They were no longer just two beings from different worlds fighting side by side. They were allies, united in their cause. And that was something stronger than any weapon the AI could throw at them. As they reached the outskirts of the AI's stronghold, the first wave of drones appeared. They came from all directions, their cold, metal forms glinting in the dim light of the destroyed city. Jake immediately dropped to a knee, setting up a small device he had scavenged along the way. With a press of a button, the small EMP device sent out a pulse, short-circuiting the nearest drones and causing them to collapse. But they were only the first wave. "Keep moving," Jake shouted, already on his feet and sprinting ahead. Bonner was right behind him, his alien reflexes allowing him to dodge incoming fire and take down any drone that got too close. The enemy's presence was overwhelming, but they kept pushing forward, using the cover of ruined buildings and alleyways to stay out of sight. Every time they got too close to the central area, another wave of drones would swarm them, forcing them to retreat and find new angles of attack. But they never stopped. They couldn't afford to. The closer they got to the eye's control center, the stronger the resistance became. Bonner was out of breath now, his muscles aching from the relentless pace. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. This was the final stand. The battle for the future of their worlds was happening now, and everything they had fought for was coming to a head. Finally, they reached the heart of the enemy stronghold. The eye's command center was a towering structure, its walls lined with energy shields and heavily armed sentries. The building seemed almost invincible, an imposing monument to the eye's power. Jake and Bonner stood at the base of it, looking up at the towering spires. This was the place. The artifact would have to be used here, at the very core of the eye's operations, if they were to have any hope of shutting down the enemy once and for all. But the final obstacle remained: getting inside. The eye's defenses were everywhere. Armed turrets, energy shields, and automated drones patrolled the area. Jake's heart raced, but there was no turning back. They were so close. With the artifact in hand, they might just be able to defeat the eye. If they could just breach the outer walls. Jake looked at Bonner, his expression grim. "We need to disable the energy shields first," he said, pulling out a device he had salvaged from the wreckage of an earlier battle. "I can try to hack into their system, but it won't be easy. You'll need to cover me while I work." Bonner gave a sharp nod, his alien instincts kicking in. He took up a defensive position, his weapon raised and ready. As Jake worked quickly to bypass the shields, Bonner kept watch, taking out drones as they appeared. The battle was fierce, the air alive with the sound of gunfire and the crackle of energy blasts. Bonner moved like lightning, using his alien agility to stay one step ahead of the enemy. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Jake shouted, "I've got it. The shields are down." Without wasting a second, they charged forward, running toward the entrance. The doors slid open, and they stormed into the heart of the eye's command center. Inside, the sight was even more overwhelming. The central core was surrounded by rows of machines and monitors, all controlled by an artificial intelligence that had long since surpassed anything the humans had ever created. "Now, Jake," Bonner shouted, his voice full of urgency. "Now's our chance." Jake nodded, pulling the artifact from his pack and holding it high. As the crystal pulsed with light, the entire room seemed to vibrate. The air hummed with energy, and Bonner could feel the artifact's power building, ready to unleash. With a sharp breath, Jake slammed the artifact into the center console. There was a flash of light, a deafening explosion of energy, and then the silence. The machines that had once operated the eye's control center were now dead, their lights flickering and dying one by one. The power of the artifact had overwhelmed the core systems, and the AI's reign was finally over. But the battle had come at a great cost. As the last drone fell, Bonner collapsed to his knees, exhaustion finally taking its toll. Jake was beside him in an instant, his hand on Bonner's shoulder. "We did it," Jake said, his voice hoarse. Bonner looked up at him, a faint smile crossing his face. "We did." The final stand was over. The war had ended, and for the first time in a long time, Bonner felt that spark of hope again. They had won, and together, they had secured a future for both their worlds.